On today's panel, we will focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I am very thrilled to be here. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. My name is Grace Reyes, CEO of the Investment Diversity Exchange, also known as TIDE. We promote diversity and inclusion within the investment industry. We amplify the voice of the underrepresented communities, and we're a partner to the largest US public pension plans. A DEI panel would not be complete without diversity of thought. And on today's panel, we have exactly that. We have three perspectives within the institutional private market space. We have Iñigo Garcia, Head of Investor Relations at Base 10, which is a VC firm in San Francisco that notably donates 50% of its profits to historically Black colleges and universities. We also have Khalida Ali, Director of Diversity and Inclusion, Vista Equity Partners, who can give us insights from a global private equity focus on enterprise software investments. And lastly, we have Meredith Heimburger, Partner and Head of Impact, Global Endowment Management, which builds and manages investment portfolios on behalf of foundations, endowments, and nonprofits. So let's get started. As the central hub for connecting movers and shakers in the investment industry, TIDE is filled with professionals that come from all walks of life, experiences, and backgrounds. I love hearing everyone's story, so we'll start there. Meredith, you spent nearly a decade at Teach for America and then decided to move to investing. What was that like?
Sure. So my meandering path here actually started 100 years ago with my grandfather, who was born to a poor Greek immigrant family and lived in and out of stable housing in a port town in Texas. But he got two things that really changed his trajectory and my family's trajectory, and that was first, a great education, and second, he had really big ideas, and he was able to get investment capital invested into his big ideas. And so that really changed his story and it changed his life. So when I graduated from college with that story as sort of my family's background, I went into education, wanting to support kids growing up the way my grandfather had grown up. But what I soon realized was, even with education, some kids, no matter how talented or brilliant or hardworking, just don't get that kind of investment. They don't get that investment in their ideas or in their communities or in their schools or in their futures. And so about halfway into my career, I looked around and just said, there has to be a better way to invest in the ideas and the people who are going to make our world a better and more equitable place. I still believe education is a key contributor, but it's not the only answer. And so it was with that background that I was then invited to come to Global Endowment Management, where we work to leverage the assets of our endowment and foundation clients to invest in the big ideas of people and companies and fund managers who are transforming the future and making it a more diverse and sustainable place. And so that's sort of how I ended up where I am today. In terms of how that transition went, I was then on day one and still am a complete misfit in the investment industry. So I spend most of my time sort of droning on about reimagining capitalism as a system that can work for everyone and thinking about how to build a more sustainable future. But I think it's important to have those folks around the table, and it's a testament to our partners 10 years ago who recognized that the focus on mission alignment and values alignment in investment portfolios is going to continue to grow, and it's really important that people like us are there to steward the future of how we invest.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, Khalida, Meredith just mentioned about education. You have an interesting story where how you were introduced to the world of private equity, and it wasn't just through education. Can you just share with us how you became part of this ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And it actually does tie into what Meredith mentioned around the transformative nature of education, because one of the things that I often find myself asking or questioning is how does someone who is from West Philadelphia, who is the first in her family to do a lot of things, that being graduating from college, this person who declined attending the University of Pennsylvania to attend an HBCU Spelman, find herself being the head of diversity at Vista Equity Partners. And in order to answer that question, really, it goes back to the fall of 2004 when I was at Spelman, and there were two managing directors from Morgan Stanley, one woman by the name of Carla Harris, who some of you in the audience might know. They came to campus to meet with students, and it really started with the question of, have you considered a career in investment banking? And for me, the answer to that was no. I wasn't even familiar with the industry, but it was like, hey, we think this is something that you should consider. And so I did. I ended up interning at Morgan Stanley. I joined Morgan Stanley full time. So my career actually started in capital markets. And it was the dynamic of being on a trading floor and wondering, where are more people that look like me, especially since, I had come from Spelman. And that is really what informed my interest in DEI. So I've worked primarily within financial services and technology, which has been amazing and incredible with being at Vista, given Vista works at the intersection of those two industries. So it's not lost on me the unique aspect of the role that I have and the seat that I have within the organization that I work at.
That's great. And now, Iñigo, you give a different perspective in that you come from an international education, and you spent a decade on the consultant side and then shifted your path to focus on early-stage investments that have tangible impact parameters. What has driven your career?
Yeah, a pleasure to be here. So as you mentioned, I grew up in Spain, studied in 3 different countries, and ended up working for Cambridge Associates to invest in private equity and venture capital. And the job was very interesting because it allowed me to meet hundreds of managers, always to find differentiation. And when you're investing with partners looking forward to 10, 15 years out, differentiation can come in many forms, but it's always differentiation of thought, of background, perspectives that you can bring to the table. That's actually how I met Base 10. At the onset of Base 10 being formed in 2017 by Adi and TJ, I actually thought that they were going to do things in a differentiated way. 5 years forward, I've seen their progression, how the firm has evolved, and when they asked me to join the firm about 6 months ago, I was honored and privileged to do so.
That's great. And now let's stick to you and dig into the topic of DEI. Base 10 is founded on 2 fundamental pillars, research and purpose. So how does DEI fit within those 2 pillars?
Yeah, absolutely. So as an investment firm investing in technology companies, we want to be informed about the megatrends. We want to partner with the best companies. But we also recognize that purpose is key to profits. We want to find those founders. DEI is at the core of that. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a framework that allows to empower your workforce, allows you to hire, retain the best talent, and companies are starting to look to us as a partner that brings that to the table. So as you mentioned earlier in the introduction, we decided to donate 50% of our carried interest to create scholarships to underrepresented minorities in the US to create opportunities for them in technology, in the investment world. And we do that in the name of the companies that we partner with. But we also work with companies around creating frameworks that allow for changes. So for example, like we have partnered with about a dozen of our companies this summer in creating internships for HBCU students. This is the first time ever that they were hiring, they had an internship program and they were hiring from HBCUs. We actually last week organized with one of our companies, Handshake, the largest career fair for online career fair for HBCU students. So that was really exciting where we had like 3,000 participants. So we are embedding purpose and diversity and inclusion into the cap tables, and that's very much how it fits into how we define purpose in everything that we do at Base 10.
Well, I'm familiar with Handshake, actually, because that's where we source talent. Meredith, Iñigo touched upon creating frameworks around DEI, and you had been quoted on Barron's Magazine last year that GEM has an equity lens framework that it applies to managers. that 25% of the firm's investment contribute to racial and social equity, and 36% of the managers GEM invest in are diverse. I'd like to know, how do you and GEM think about DEI, and how does this play out in your portfolios?
Sure. It's fun hearing those numbers because they keep going up. So thank you for reminding me of those. I think for us, studies tell us that diverse teams outperform homogeneous teams. That's true at investment firms, that's true in public companies, it's true across organizations. And so we know that diverse teams outperform. We also know that about 99% of global institutional assets are managed by predominantly white male teams. And for us, where we're mostly investing in alternatives, it's all about finding alpha and looking for ways that we can outperform and find differentiated investments, and better yet, if we believe that our competitors aren't there yet. And so if you're just looking at studies, you're just thinking about data, it absolutely makes sense for us to be investing with more diverse-led teams in our portfolio. It's a much better way for us to outperform and have a competitive edge. So this isn't a moral imperative for our firm. It's a strategic investment of our time and resources at GEM. The kicker is that in order to have a more diverse pipeline of opportunities to invest in, you have to look at equity. The reality is that there are certain groups who have been systematically excluded and in some cases harmed by the systems that we're working in. And so I can't just say, I want 36% of my investments to be led by diverse teams and then expect it to happen overnight. I have to actually focus on who are the groups who have been systematically excluded. How do we focus on investing in those people and in those strategies that are serving those individuals and communities based on their racial and social identities? And so we measure diversity as teams that have people from different backgrounds and identities, but then we also look at equity. We look at both racial equity and social equity lens, which is who are the groups of people who have been excluded or harmed as a result of their racial and social identities, and how do we identify and measure our ability to invest in strategies that lift them up. And I just have to add that one thing that's been sort of the biggest learning on our team is when you invest in those strategies, you then have a really differentiated opportunity set. And so when we invest with women entrepreneurs, overnight you have a Black women-owned bank that serves as a banking hub for Black small business owners, or you have a maternal healthcare platform that's combating the reality that America's maternal mortality rates are unparalleled in the developing world, or you have a platform for non-English speakers who are supporting their families with elder care. And so we end up with a really interesting opportunity set because we are focused on not just increasing diversity, but getting to diversity by focusing on equity.
That's great.
Grace, I was just going to chime in really quickly to the piece that you mentioned around equity and why that's so important. And I hope that other LPs take heed as well, because there was a study by the Knight Foundation where they found that of the $82 trillion in terms of assets under management, just 1.4% are managed by diverse firms. So when you look at potential, there's a lot, that can happen, but it will take a lot of intentionality.
Exactly.
So hope you share that with your peers.
We do.
Okay.
Well, intentionality is key. And so let's stick to you, Khalida. Vista released an ESG and DEI report late last year. And in this report, you stated, "We believe the investment industry has the potential to lead and tremendous capacity to drive DE&I objectives. It is our hope that a comprehensive DE&I framework becomes essential to the DNA of all asset managers, given the demonstrable benefits of DEI programs in creating better business outcomes." So how has Vista been addressing this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that's been interesting just from our conversation is seeing how DEI can be applied and manifest itself in different ways across different organizations. So for us at Vista, our approach has been that we attract or focus on it with a strategic focus. So we have a strategic framework and plan that all of our DEI efforts are anchored around, and really our goal is to apply a DEI lens to the Vista ecosystem. So what that means is we think about DEI with respect to Vista, the management company. We think about it with respect to our portfolio. That's where we really go deep, because you have this multiplier effect that can happen. And then we also think about it as it relates to business engagement and things around supplier diversity, diversifying your service providers, and then also community engagement as well. We do think it's principally important to ensure that we're doing the great work now to invest in future leaders who will hopefully enter into this space. But one of the things that I think is important to call out is that DEI expands beyond just hiring of people. It also applies to the business that you actually do as well. And so that's something that we take very seriously and we hold firm to.
And so for the GPs in this room, what opportunities do they have to leverage their portfolio companies for broader impact? Is it just more talent hiring or supplier diversity?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think if we really wanted to see change and accelerate change, the private equity industry in particular is uniquely positioned to do that. McKinsey had also issued a study where they looked at U.S. PE firms, and their ownership is for over 18,000 companies, you know? So think about the potential that's there. When we focus on our portfolio engagement, we have 3 key areas of focus, and I think that can apply to other PE firms as well. We focus on executive leadership team engagement, so the ELT teams across our companies. We focus on board diversity stewardship and ultimately driving accountability. So I do think one place where other GPs can start is by looking across their corporate boards. So these are the individuals who play influential roles, you know, within the governance of companies. And so you can do that in 2 ways. One is both the representation of those boards, but then the other element is elevating DEI to be a topic that is discussed regularly at the board level. And so we've seen great progress by focusing on those 2 areas. At Vista currently, 84% of our boards have at least one woman, 87% of our boards have at least one person of color, but it doesn't stop there. We also recognize, if we think about equity, the importance of building out pipelines as well. So we created 2 programs with the NACD, National Association of Corporate Directors, focused on building board-ready talent. So I think GPs could just start there, you know, and see and make great strides.
Thanks for sharing that. And as a GP, Iñigo, how have the pledges of your firm has made giving back impacted your business when it comes to deal flow and fundraising? And what do other VCs and other private market firms need to understand about how DEI can drive ROI or returns?
Yeah, so 2-part question, maybe just more broadly on the market. We recognize and we have seen over and over again that diversity of thought, diversity of thinking, differentiated perspectives creates better business outcomes, right? And when you are creating better business outcomes, you are maximizing the returns for your LPs, for the ecosystem as a whole. So DEI is core to that. Actually, I was talking to one LP of ours, and they told me that in private markets, there were 280 Black or, minority-led or women-led venture capital and private equity funds in the market last year. But as we just mentioned earlier, like a very small percentage of the assets managed are led or managed by those firms. So it requires investors actually to be forward-looking. You can't constantly be investing looking at the rear-view mirror. Like you have to think about what is going to be the outcomes and how you want to be investing looking forward 10, 15 years when you're looking at private equity and venture capital. So I think that's, a takeaway for the market that I have tried to apply at Cambridge Associates, and now I think we continue to share as I think we're trying to lead by example. Specifically for us as a venture capital firm, we're seeing that we are able to partner with great companies, great funders, not because we are the largest venture capital firm, not because we are the most well-known venture capital firm, at least yet, but we are getting there, and they are coming to us because we are approaching DEI in an authentic way. We're embedding diversity on purpose into their cap tables. And this is a way of forging a better path to IPO. We're investing in companies when they are pretty young. We are creating systems and processes that will allow them to be better companies in their public life. And this is a key component to value creation. So it has really helped as a way of engaging with companies that are hard to access, that have plenty of options for financing, and they are looking to partner with Base 10 because of what we're trying to do from diversity, equity, and inclusion as a mechanism to driving value creation.
Well, it seems like Base 10 is doing a lot of great things, doing well and doing good. Meredith, Iñigo mentioned that even with DEI initiatives, there is still small allocation to diverse firms. So as an allocator, you influence where capital flows. What do you think is the most significant barrier or challenge that female or diverse managers face in our industry? And what role do allocators like yourself play in reducing these barriers and challenges?
I mean, I think the biggest challenge that we're all facing is a history of entrenched systems that are interconnected and compounding. So we've talked today about banking, education, healthcare, access to venture capital. And the reality is these are all systems that are linked together that have contributed to where we are today. And we like to talk about systems that are broken, but frankly, some of these systems have worked the way they were supposed to. They have concentrated capital in the hands of a small group of people. And so it's easy to get frustrated and to want to throw our hands up and walk away, but the reality is we are working against something that is really embedded in our history, and so it's going to take time to get there. Allocators have a huge responsibility and a huge role that we can play in starting to undo some of that and work harder. I think I love what Khalida says about sort of an intentional process to really look at that. I think there's two big things that we do on our side that others can do. The first is asking questions about how we got to where we are today as a firm and as an organization and as a system. And so I'm sure you've all heard of the exercise where you ask 5 whys to get to the root cause. But, why is my portfolio predominantly managed by white men? Well, because our pipeline is predominantly led by white males. Why is our pipeline predominantly led by white males? Well, because our networking is how we source opportunities. So maybe we should stop using just our networks. Well, why are our networks the way that we are, and how have we developed them? We haven't been intentional about expanding our networks to include more diversity. Ask the tough questions to figure out, why are you getting the results that you're getting? And then you have to be brave enough to address those challenges and to invest time and resources in really changing some of those systems. A lot of the training that most traditional asset allocators received trained them to think about the world in a very specific way, where you end up selecting investments for a variety of reasons that can introduce implicit bias in your process. So look at those systems, ask yourself tough questions, and address what's going wrong that's leading to the outcomes that you have. They're not accidental, but they also might not be intentional. So be intentional about those outcomes. As one example, we signed the Due Diligence 2.0 commitment, which was a pledge by allocators to look at some of the traditional investment underwriting criteria that we use and understand where they might be introducing implicit bias, and then address those to take them out of our systems.
I like the 5 whys.
Yes.
And so, Khalida, something that allocators and GPs share with Tide is that they have a pipeline problem. They don't know where to source diverse talent. Is that the challenge that you're seeing, or what other challenges do you face?
Yeah, it's interesting. That has not been our challenge, actually. But I actually think it ties to what Meredith just said in terms of like the systems, and I view that as an extension of bias in terms of thinking that the pipeline doesn't exist. One thing that we do firmly believe in is that talent is equally distributed, but we know that opportunity is not. And so then if you want to uncover, okay, well, what are the things that you do? Yes, ask yourself those questions to understand what are our current processes in terms of how we are identifying talent. And I think the other thing is you have to create it. So at Vista, we have focused very intently on building out talent efforts. So everything from having an internship program so that students are aware of this industry. We also have created the Frontier Fellows program, which is for students who come from underrepresented backgrounds. They participate in our private equity internship, but then also receive a $25,000 scholarship to help offset any educational costs. We've been involved with Girls Who Invest since the organization's inception So they work with young women to introduce them to the asset management space after their sophomore year in college. And then this past year, or actually no, this summer, we launched a Rising Sophomore internship program. And so this is engaging students even earlier so that they are aware of the industries. Really, the focus is on how do you increase access and opportunity? Because I would say historically, the window of opportunity has been pretty narrow in terms of pursuit with entering the industry. And so our goal and focus is on increasing the length or width, of that window of opportunity so that more students are aware of it, can be prepared for the industry, and can also pursue it. But does the pipeline exist? Yes, absolutely.
I like your quote, talent is equally distributed and opportunity is not. Truly agree. And so one diversity metric that we often look at is gender parity. And at Tide's inaugural diversity event this year, we had about 50% of women in the room, so about 200 people. But that alone is not enough. How do you measure the success of diversity programs, and what other metrics should we consider in measuring our success? Iñigo, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I think the way we are trying to measure the success of what we do is by engaging not just with the CEO, but engaging with employee resource groups, by really embedding and a continued activity of how you are implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts into the systems and processes of the organization every day. We don't have necessarily a scope of saying X% of our portfolio has to be a founder that comes from a minority background. But what we want to do with that founder is work towards untapping value that is coming from working with sources of talent that they may not have thought existed before. So historically, black colleges and universities are a huge part of that. So we are actively starting to measure that across our portfolio. I think there is a lack of a standardization as to how you measure DEI best practices. We are early days, and we're just trying to work with companies on programmatically incorporating those changes and actively thinking about eliminating the barriers as to how they think about these processes, because as I mentioned earlier, we think that it is one of the biggest drivers of value creation, but the asset management industry as a whole, and I think venture capital in particular, is very far behind, and we are putting benchmark reports with our companies, and we're using public comps because there's not private comparables that are yet relevant. So it's still early days, but we are very much trying to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion reporting and benchmarking to actually create actionable outcomes.
Can I just add to that quickly? I think white women were the greatest beneficiaries of affirmative action, particularly when they were entering the workforce in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and that has continued into today. And so I think for a lot of folks that set up diversity programs within their companies or firms, they end up filling those with the first people that come in and fill them, right? And so you can find yourself in a position where you say, well, half of the people here are women. We've done a great job from diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the reality is you haven't gone the step further to look at which groups are you systematically promoting and incorporating and including when you say the word diverse. Are you thinking about all groups and diversity? And are you really getting diversity of thought if you end up in a room with all white men and women? And so I think for groups who have found themselves in the amazing opportunity of having gender parity, it's time to go to the next level. What groups are still not in this room? What groups of people have we not identified to bring into our pipeline or into our company or our investment portfolio?
Yeah, and I love that you raised that, because I would say this is probably the first time I've heard someone mention and focus on the power of intersectionality as it relates to this topic in particular. And so if I think about metrics, bringing it back to your question, Grace, and even what you were talking about, Iñigo, how can you gauge or assess and see if you are making traction? Having that baseline is a great starting place to understand like where you actually are starting. One of the things that we are excited about at Vista is that we have achieved gender parity within our workforce, but to your point, it does extend. We look at where are those folks being hired, what roles are they in, are people in roles of power, influence, and then also when we think about representation as it relates to people of color, we also take another cut and look at underrepresented ethnic minorities as well to understand what is that makeup. In terms of engagement across the portfolio, there are a number of different metrics that we look at. There's everything from board diversity, but then we also look at board engagement as it relates to DEI. We ask CEOs of all majority-controlled companies to establish DEI MBOs, and they have the autonomy to determine what those goals are. But a lot of it is also around establishing the tools and frameworks, putting those mechanisms in place so that individuals like have the support to action off of all of this. Something else that's really important is internships, so I'm glad that you mentioned that as well. And I think that there's a lot of power behind internships because one of the things that is always top of mind for me is fast forward like 10, 15 years, this conversation should not be the same, you know, but it will only change if like investments are happening now that will have payoffs like in the future. So internships, that's another thing that we take a look at. And then on the business engagement front, we also do a lot of work on the capital market side in terms of the brokers that we work with for companies that are either going public or having an equity offering.
So one common theme that I heard is engagement with business leaders and CEOs, so individuals that can make an impact, and then also standardizing, reporting, and creating frameworks. So if you can't measure it, how can you know that you improved?
Yeah, maybe just on that point, every time we talk about reporting, I tend to think about regulation, but none of this is driven by regulation. I think we are driven by better business outcomes, which I think is very important, and I think it's the key to actually like staying a step ahead. If we're waiting for regulation to come in and implement best practices, we would not have been successful. So I think what we're seeing is actually like driving by example and not just like waiting for regulation, but actually driving better business outcomes. And we are seeing that is coming from stakeholders, from the workforce, from the people that were engaging our co-investors. So this is, I think, all being driven by the interest of generating best returns for our LPs and not regulation. And I think when we talk about reporting, sometimes you tend to think like, oh, it's going to be driven by regulation.
DEI.
I just wanted to say, Iñigo, you make a really good point too in terms of like the focus is on value creation, you know, so it debunks this myth that there is this trade-off that happens if you prioritize DEI.
And so with the final minute, what are your last thoughts that you'd like to leave the audience with? Iñigo.
Maybe part of it is that we want to be ahead of regulation. But also we want to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion in an authentic way. We are embedding these best practices into the cap tables of our companies, and they are looking to us because we are being authentic about it, and it is entirely aligned to how we run our own firm. So I think this is a value that everybody should live by, and we're excited that we are one of the few venture capital firms we're seeing that is, I think, doing and investing a lot of resources in driving better outcomes in the E&I.
Khalida?
For me, I would just say that change is possible, but it will only happen with strategic focus and effort.
Awesome. Meredith?
There's a clear business case for investing in diversity, and if there were anything else that you saw where you felt like there was an alpha opportunity that would drive better returns and better outcomes for your company, you would invest your time and your people in getting in that direction. And so I think just like any other goal or objective for any company or investment firm or asset allocator, to look at this is the business case, these are the objectives that we have, and this is how we're going to get there, and build in the frameworks and go after it, and the returns will come with it.
Great. Well, thank you to my panelists. Thank you to Salt and the Prozac team for amplifying the voice of the diverse communities in our industry. Thanks.